Hi, Eric.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good. How's life in Silver Spring?
It is flourishing. There is a flourishing in Silver Spring. It's like Florence in the 16th century here.
Really?
Yeah.
And are you partly responsible for that, or was it like that before you moved there?
I think a little bit of both. We've got some smart people in Silver Spring and smart people who cannot afford the pricier neighborhoods around Washington, D.C. And, the Discovery Channel moved here about 10 or so years ago. And that was like the anchor that brought all these shops and restaurants and,
really? Is that
and all
true?
this other good stuff. We have both upscale shopping and pawn shops and gun shops at the same time. It's sort of, in between in terms of...
It sounds like the perfect formula.
It is.
Pawn shops and gun shops. What could go wrong in a neighborhood like that?
Well, and fancy restaurants. So that's what I like. Is I don't know what happens when places become truly gentrified, but all the life and the soul gets sucked out of them, and that has not happened entirely in Silver Spring yet.
I've been there. I like it.
Yeah.
So let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Eric Weiner, most recently the author of Man Seeks God. Previously the author of the bestseller, The Geography of Bliss. In fact, you were on Blogging Heads talking about that some time ago.
I was, and that was a lot of fun.
But then you were seeking mere happiness.
Right.
You're now going to greater depths. Man seeks God.
Well, I needed a topic that was bigger than a search for happiness, and what is bigger than happiness, really?
God?
Yes, I think so. I think, at the end of the Geography of Bliss, I sort of conclude oddly, after going around the world searching for the happiest places and really for the quote-unquote formula for happiness, I conclude that we don't want happiness, at least not happiness alone. We want lives that are meaningful, and we want lives that are fully experienced, with a capital E, and we want, I think, this thing called God, which I define fairly loosely in the book.
Okay. And the book begins, tell me if I've got this right, but I mean, the inauguration of your quest is this episode where you were rushed to an emergency room, suffering from scary symptoms.
Right.
I think they were even summoning a surgeon.
Yes.
You were very apprehensive. A nurse approached you who you thought might know more about your condition than you did, and somewhat ominously leaned down, whispered in your ear, "Have you found your God yet?"
Those are her exact words. Have you found your God yet? Which really freaked me out, because now I think, well, she's seen my medical records and my CT scans, and she knows something, and I should prepare to meet my maker. I was scared. I was honestly scared. I tend to veer toward hypochondria anyway, but as I like to say, hypochondriacs get sick too. And I thought my number was up. And long story short, I was not dying. I merely had a severe case of gas, intestinal gas. It took them 3 days and God knows how many thousands of dollars.
There are many paths to God, Eric.
And this was the intestinal pad. I'm discharged from the hospital. I go back to my everyday life, what the Chinese call the world of dust, our everyday existence. And in a previous time, I would have just exhaled and dismissed the nurse's question, but maybe, I don't know, the onset of middle age, or maybe I've always been a closet spiritual seeker, but for whatever reason, I decided to seriously answer her question.
Well, here's a question. I mean, to what extent have you been a spiritual seeker? One reviewer described this book as Woody Allen channeling Karen Armstrong, and it is a very funny book. You're a very funny writer. And the Woody Allen comparison, I don't think is confined to the kind of stand-up comic aspect. Woody Allen, a certain amount of his humor, a certain amount of it comes from sheer neurosis. I mean, him being this neurotic character. But there's also this
existential.
Right.
Yeah.
And would you say that you are that type of person? Had been even before this nurse thing?
Yes. I think the way to describe myself up to that point is a spiritual voyeur. I like to watch. And as a former foreign correspondent for NPR, I had a front row seat to many of the world's religions and religious practices. So I was able to dip in and out of these worlds, but always on the sidelines, always watching, whether it's, being in Dharamsala in India, home of the Dalai Lama and a few 100,000 Tibetan refugees, and watching what's going on there, or in many Muslim countries, or in Catholic countries. But I never participated. And I just did a lot of reading. Joseph Campbell was once asked what his spiritual practice was, and he said, I underline books. And that has been me too. I love to read and underline, and I have read a lot of spiritual books, a lot of, it's a bit embarrassing, but I guess you would call them self-help books as well. And I underline a lot, and I watch a lot, but I didn't do much. I didn't actually really meditate or pray or do any of the things that real religious people do.
Okay. And your background was very secular Jewish, right?
Gastronomical Jews. Yeah.
Yeah.
All about the food.
All about the food.
Yeah. And, this is so typical. I can't tell you how many Jews, Catholics, other people I meet say the same thing. They were really turned off by religion when they were younger. Either turned off or never turned on, just sort of lay dormant. I did go to Hebrew school for a while, and it seemed completely irrelevant to my life. I couldn't understand what we could possibly have to learn from these people who've been dead for thousands of years and who hadn't even figured out indoor plumbing. What can they teach us? And it seemed, to be honest, Judaism seemed like a lot of rules to me. It seemed like, do this, and actually more common is don't do that. And it seemed kind of picky and irrelevant and a bit nasty at times. If you read the Old Testament, there's some nastiness in there. So I didn't think there was anything there for me, but I've always felt that there is more to this world than meets the eye, and that there is more to life than simply rational thought. I just have this intuitive sense that rational thinking is the tip of the iceberg. And I suppose Dr. Freud said this before me, but just a sense that there is more going on here. But that religion, as I knew it growing up, wasn't the answer to that question of what is the more.
But you can mean two things by there's more than meets the eye. I mean, the Freudian sense was a sheerly kind of straightforward scientific sense. In other words, some of the information processing in our brain is not conscious. There's that, but then there's also, kind of something out there, and
out there or in here. I mean,
if it's in here though, then it's more kind of like the Freudian thing.
Look, I'll say this. I spent, years researching happiness for my previous book, and one thing that I discovered is that really well-educated people, master's degrees, PhDs, are not happy. They are less happy statistically than people with just a bachelor's degree. If merely mastering what's involved in rational thought was all that was needed to experience happiness or bliss, then university campuses would be filled with blissed out people. And they're not. The professors are not. And that's just one example. I don't think that we can just think our way to the kind of sublime spiritual experience that many people, even atheists, I think, want to have. Spiritual experience, I said, sublime experiences of bliss and happiness that all of us want to achieve. I don't think that they are achievable merely by furrowing our brow and thinking really, really hard.
Okay.
You seem flummoxed by that.
Well, I'm very reflective. I was thinking, in a way, then, in light of that, another way to ask the question I asked earlier, when I said, is your angst of a kind of philosophical, Woody Allen-esque sort? The
answer is yes.
Okay, but with Woody Allen, it's questions like life after death, right? I mean, I think, as I recall,
death is the big thing with Woody Allen. I mean,
right, and the hope that he could find some reassurance that there's something more. I mean, you get a sense for real yearning in Woody Allen for old-fashioned religion in the sense that, yes, there's actually life after death. There's somebody out there who cares. And I guess when you suggest that you could find reassurance from what's in here as opposed to what's out there, I'm wondering whether that's exactly like Woody.
I think we're engaged in a bit of semantics. I'm a big fan of Alan Watts, the late great British philosopher and part-time guru, and he said essentially that we overstate the distinction between inside and outside. If I were to draw a circle like this or show you this, you could say I've drawn a circle, or you can say that I've drawn a hole, or it's a way of saying that the distinction between inside and outside is often overstated. That's why, when I do all this traveling, which I do for my books, people say, well, why did you travel around the world looking for happiness or God? It's right inside of you. You can find it there. Well, yeah, but what I'm trying to do by traveling is trick myself, trick my brain, my mind, whatever you want to call it, into a different way of perceiving the world. And travel can be very helpful. Travel out there in order to rejigger my wiring or whatever in here.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about some of the stuff you found. So start off with Sufism, which is not exactly mainstream Islam. The more mystical variant. And you, as anyone would, I think, turn to the noted Sufi mystic Wayne. Is Wayne the Buddhist?
Wayne is the Buddhist.
Wayne is the Buddhist. So who is the
Well, I began my spiritual journey, Bob, in the place where all spiritual journeys begin, Northern California, near Mendocino. I stumbled across something called Sufi camp. Now, this was a wonderful juxtaposition of images of Rumi, the great Sufi poet, and the whirling dervishes, and sort of, what are those things called that you roast over the fire? S'mores. Remember those? S'mores.
Yes, I didn't. Yeah. I had never understood the connection with Sufism, but I bet they're very good.
Well, I didn't either. But I thought this is going to be fun. It was in California wine country, and the Sufis are the drunkards of Islam. And I thought, this is going to be good. And I got there, and I quickly fell down that rabbit hole of the New Age movement, where everything was a mishmash, or what's the term of art right now? A mashup. I guess it was a mashup. It was mush. We would start the day with the recitation of Buddhist sutras. We'd do some Hindu-based yoga. We had a very wonderful Jewish Sabbath. And there was some Sufism thrown in as well. And I did meet some interesting people. But I think the problem with Sufi camp is the problem with a lot of these religions when they're imported to this country is they get watered down. They get mushy. And I sort of decided at that point that if I was going to do this seriously, I needed to go to the source as much as possible. And to get out of Northern California. Because, look, I could have explored all 8 religions that I explore in the book without leaving probably Marin County, just north of San Francisco. So I got on a plane and I flew to Turkey and had, I think, some fairly genuine insights there into the world of Sufism.
What was the best thing? What did you most like about Sufism?
Oh, I mean, they're so filled with heart, and they use that term a lot. And I don't know exactly what they mean by it, but they seem to believe that the heart is obviously not this thing pumping in your chest, this muscle, but it's also not this kind of mushy hallmark thing either, which is the way we use it here. The Sufis believe the heart is almost like an organ, or I guess a metaphor for an organ. It is our intuitive sense for what is right for us. And my Sufi friends that I met in Turkey were constantly telling me to listen to my heart. And I didn't know exactly what they meant, because when I tried to listen to my heart, my intuitive sense, before making some decision, I always get static. I never fully understood what people mean by that. But the Sufis have this phrase they call polishing the heart, which is the whole point of all their practices, whether it's whirling like dervishes or doing something called zikr, which means literally remembrance of God. And it's very repetitive, almost like a meditation. You're repeating, for instance, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, over and over again. And the point of all that is to sort of quiet the rational brain. similar to Buddhism, I think, and to let something else bubble up. So I found that kind of inspiring, to be honest. And I was impressed with the people I met, both the Westerners who have converted to Sufism, the Muslim people who were full-time, well, not full-time Sufis, there's really no such thing, but who were engaged Sufis. And I think that's an important point I want to make is, judge the tree by the fruit. If you want to know if a religion is good or not, look at its followers. If you want to know if a teacher is real or not, look at his or her followers. And I liked the Sufis I met. They seemed to be real. And I also had a great experience whirling like a dervish, which...
Now, that part is, I assume, optional. In other words, not all Sufis do the whirling part. No. Not all lay Sufis do the whirling part, right? I mean, there's kind of expert whirlers.
Well, there are. In fact, there's one order. There are about 50 tariqas, or orders of Sufism. This gets a bit complicated, but this is Boggy Heads TV, and complication is okay.
That's our business.
Complexity. Yes, not complication, but complexity. There's a difference. And there's really, as far as I know, one main order that does the whirling. It's called the Mevlevi order, named after Mevlana, which is the proper name for Rumi, the Sufi poet, who I assume you're familiar with. Rumi means literally just one from Rome, I believe, but it's sort of his nickname. Mevlana is the actual name that people in the Muslim world refer to him. And he started this order back in the 13th century, and it continued after his death. And, the legend is that he was walking through the market in Konya, the town he lived in central Turkey, and he heard a goldsmith hammering on the gold, and he just was filled with this ecstasy, and he started to turn like a dervish, and that's supposedly how it started. But have you ever seen a performance?
Yeah. What foreign country was I in? I was in Barcelona, and there was something. It was live.
Home of Sufism.
Well, there was some international thing going on. It was at that big La Familia Sagrada chapel thing.
Right.
And I was in my hotel room, but it was being broadcast on live TV, and they had these dervishes, and they were amazing. And I assume that part of the deal there, I mean, you referred to Sufis as the drunkards of Islam. You mean metaphorically.
Yes.
I think. And I assume that these people, one thing that can happen if you whirl enough is you get this sense of ecstatic union with the divine, right?
Yes, again, shutting down the rational part of the brain. And what I was really mesmerized watching the performance. I was on the outskirts of Istanbul, it wasn't a touristy area at all. I was the only Westerner in the room. And what got me about it is that it's both very active on the one hand. They're whirling, spinning, fast, and also very contemplative at the same time. And they say that if you are close to God, you don't get dizzy. I did get very dizzy, I should add, so that means I have work to do. But it is a technique. And the thing is, you see this across all religions. You see these techniques. They can be movement, like davening in Judaism, for instance, or circumambulation, and that the Buddhists do around stupas. In almost every religious practice, there are movements and actually more often sounds, repetitive sounds, mantras, bells, that sort of thing. That again, I think are about bypassing rational thought, or at least getting deeper than rational thought. And that's the idea with the whirling dervishes.
Okay, so in the book you go from Sufism to Buddhism,
right?
Which I think sounds like it's one of your favorites.
Yeah, I hate to pick favorites among my 8 children, but if I were to pick 3, I would say it's Sufism.
Suppose you were choosing between that and what is it? Raelianism? Raelism? Named after the prophet
Rael.
Who, yeah. Well, we'll get into that later. But anyway, I think my sense is you would put Buddhism a little higher than.
Yes. And look, why are so many Americans attracted to Buddhism? Actually, I'm going to ask you that question. Why do you think so many Americans, Westerners, are these days?
Well, I think, one thing, for kind of secular seekers, Buddhism can be presented as something not involving God, even though many Buddhists in Asia believe in gods or something, but there are variants that don't involve that. And in any event, there's a version of it in America that is pretty secular, and it is of practical value. I've actually done several silent 1 week silent meditation retreats, and I'm a believer in the practical value of meditation as a serious discipline, and I'm a believer in the truth that is kind of revealed through meditation, not in the sense of seeing God or anything, but in the sense of its shedding light on the actual human predicament in a fruitful way.
Yeah, and Buddhism doesn't require you to believe anything. Buddhist teachers don't say believe this; they say do this, try this. Actually, more accurately, they're big on experimentation. The Buddha was an experimenter, right? He tried the severe ascetic path, starving himself nearly to death, and he had lived previously as a prince, a very lavish lifestyle, and he tried all sorts of things. And Buddhists to this day say, try this. This has worked for others. They like to think of themselves as doctors almost, that the Buddha was a doctor saying, he diagnosed the human condition as one of suffering and found a cause for this suffering, excessive desire, and found a cure for it, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, which consists not entirely, but largely of this kind of meditation, where you're sitting quietly with your mind. And to bring Wayne back into the picture, I was in Kathmandu looking for a Tibetan Lama to teach me. Now, there are several 100,000 Tibetans living in Nepal, and I thought it would be a good place to go, much easier to get to, actually, than Tibet and to practice Buddhism. But I couldn't find a Lama. And I asked finally an American friend, where are all the Lamas? He said, well, they're all in California or Colorado. You've flown the wrong way. But you should try Wayne. Well, which part of Tibet is Wayne from? Is it the eastern part? Because I don't recognize that Tibetan name. He said, no, Wayne is from Staten Island. And sure enough, Wayne is from Staten Island, but he's been living in Kathmandu for 30 years, and he's a serious meditator, and he speaks my language, not just English, but the sort of neurotic Jewish language that I also speak. And he turned out, I was skeptical at first, didn't like him at first, but we got along in the end, and he was my teacher.
And at the end of that episode, you seem to have become more mindful, as they say. I mean, you seem to have developed an appreciation for living in the moment, a greater appreciation than you had going in.
I had mindful moments. I'm not going to lie to you that I've become Buddha-like at all times, but I experienced some moments. I mean, really experienced them when I was in the moment, toward the end of my stay. And, again, that is largely what Buddhism is about experiencing the moment. I mean, it goes back to be here now. It sounds so simple. But what they don't tell you in the be here now bumper stickers, be here now in a certain way. A lot of spiritualism is kind of, we recognize it as sort of being true, but we don't know why. Be here now sounds good, but we're always here now. I mean, I'm talking to you in the present tense. We're always living life in the present tense. What be here now means is be here in an attentive, mindful way. And that is the way we are not normally. Now, the thing they don't tell you about meditation, because it's often sold as a sort of this relaxation practice, right? Corporations even will have meditation sessions to help you relax. I don't know about you, but I did not find it relaxing at first at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because you're with your mind and you realize how crazy it is and how it's just going off in a million different directions, and you're ready to jump out of your skin. So the relaxation does come into the picture, but considerably later. And if you've done one of these longer Vipassana meditation sessions, you must know I have not done one of those, but people who have tell me that the first 3 days is living hell, and then it's only around day 7 where your mind, you just kind of wear your mind down, and finally it says, okay, you win, I'm going to shut up for a while. So it's hard. And I think one of the dangers of the popularity of something like Buddhism is that it becomes commodified, it becomes watered down, and it's sold as a happiness pill, really, when in fact it's hard work. And I think that's okay, because one of the conclusions I reached toward the end of my book is that we don't want it too easy. You know, some of the most popular religions in this country are difficult. Buddhism, meditation is difficult. Calvinism is experiencing something of a comeback, and that's very austere. And you see these other religions like realism, this sort of hedonistic, not sort of, definitely hedonistic religion I explored in Las Vegas. You know, they've got 80,000 members around the world, which sounds good, but you're promoting nudity and sex and fun. Why don't you have more than 80,000? Why can't?
I think the UFO narrative may be getting in the way of for a lot of people.
Yeah, I hear you on that, but that's what they believe. But I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and say, take the UFO part out. But if we were to create a religion right now here, Bob, and say we're going to call it, you know, Bobism or Funism or something.
Bobism.
Bobism. Yeah, Bobism. And if the tenets of Bobism were, well, you should drink as often as you want. You should eat fatty, high-carb foods. You shouldn't work too hard. You should just have fun. You don't have, let's say you don't have to believe in the UFOs. You don't have to believe in Bob and Bobism.
No, you do have to believe in Bob. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But,
all right.
But go ahead.
Believe in Bob, but Bob is a benevolent deity. He wants you to be happy. He wants you to have lots of sex, you know, with multiple partners.
With Bob, in fact.
With Bob.
Which is the Raelian model, right?
Yes, that's usually
Rael is.
Well,
even as we speak, we know what Rael is doing right now at this moment.
Yes, because
having sex with a blonde woman who is part of what is it called? The Order of Angels?
No, Bob. I think you're being blondest. Rael has sex with all kinds of women. Only some are blonde. Brunettes.
Well, I'm revising my opinion of him.
Yes. So, okay, but my serious point here is if we were to create this religion of Bobism and make the main tenet of Bobism fun, I don't think we would get many followers. I don't think that's what people are looking for in religion. I think they're looking for some grit. They're looking to work hard. We've got the whole advertising industry in modern American mall to please our hedonistic tendencies. That's not what we're looking for in a religion or a spiritual path or philosophy for that matter.
Well, is it that people really want in a religion to be led to austerity and serious self-discipline? Or is it that they want to be told that, that they're engaging in something good? And, I mean, you know what I mean?
Here, let me give you a thought experiment. The philosopher Robert Nozick has came up with this one, and I think it's a good one. So let's pretend there's this happiness machine. Okay, happiness machine is perfectly safe. It's FDA approved and it's safe anyway. That was a joke. And you attach yourself to the happiness machine, and you lie down and you feel nothing but happiness and bliss. Nothing but happiness and bliss for the rest of your life. Now, do you want to be hooked up to the happiness machine?
Sign me up.
Okay, you are in a minority, Bob, because I ask this question everywhere I go when I talk about these things, and like 80-90% of the people, except college undergrads and Bob, say no. They don't want to be hooked up to the machine. And I don't think we would believe a religion that was selling its version of a happiness machine. And I think there's something in human nature, except for you, people who want to work at it. They want to earn their bliss.
But at the same time, have you ever turned on this TV and seen Joel Osteen? I think that's his name. He's one of these prosperity gospel guys, And of course, yes, he asks for sacrifice in some sense. I'm sure they have to tithe a certain amount to him, and various other things. But fundamentally, the prosperity gospel is about God wants you to get rich,
Yeah. I don't think there's anything wrong with being rich, but I don't think God necessarily wants you to be rich. I think God, and we can define terms a bit later, I'm using it very loosely, God wants us to be fulfilled, to be realized. And you can do that with money, you can do that without money. I do know, just to bring in a bit more of the happiness research, that people who are materialistic, now that has nothing to do with how much you own, that's an attitude, right? You can be poor and be very materialistic. People who are materialistic are less happy than people who aren't. So, yeah, go ahead, get rich, but you're not going to get this happiness or this bliss from it necessarily. You might, but I found in general that the more stuff you have, the more likely you are to be materialistic. It's, maybe Warren Buffett isn't, but the rest of us, there's a tendency there.
Well, this leads us directly to the Franciscans.
Yeah.
Who are at the other end of the materialism spectrum.
Right. They take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience.
And you spent some time with some of them.
I did in the South Bronx, in a homeless shelter, a friary, and the homeless shelter right next to it that they run. And I like them a lot, I have to say. And this was hard, writing about Christianity. Here's the one religion of the 8 I explore where my readers are going to know more about it than I do, for the most part. I knew very little about Christianity. But I had seen these Franciscans around the world when I traveled. I saw them in India. I saw them here in Washington, D.C., wearing these robes, looking like they just popped out of 13th century Italy, which they kind of have in a way. I think they are walking the walk as much as or more than just about any other Christian denomination. They're very impressive, the ones I met.
And did that they kind of tried to convert you. I don't mean in a Mormon showing up at the doorway, but it sounds like they threw out a couple of lines to that, and they wouldn't have minded if they could reel you in, right?
I'm going to have to disagree with you. They would not have minded if they reeled me in, but nobody, not the Franciscans, no one in this book tried to convert me to anything. Not even the Raelians. I think the Franciscans were, look, they opened their doors to me. I was there for several weeks, living with them, eating with them. They have their view of God and the world. They have views about controversial subjects like abortion that I don't necessarily subscribe to. And I think I want to make this point here because a lot of people, my friends here in Washington, D.C. area, and probably a lot of people watching this right now, don't have much time for religion. They believe that it is, at the very least, silly, at the worst, harmful and dangerous, and they will take Christian beliefs, for instance, out of the New Testament or the Old Testament as being absurd, and how can you believe that, and therefore the whole thing is a scam. And I feel that is narrow-minded, that there are clearly parts of any religion that are silly, that are wrong. If you're looking for religion to explain the world to you, it's going to fail. But the Franciscans are helping poor homeless people in the South Bronx. They don't own anything. Nothing. And they seem pretty darn happy. So I'm a Jamesian in this sense, and I mean William James, the great philosopher and psychologist who wrote the great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James famously said, "Truth is what works." And I love that quote. Truth is what works. And he doesn't mean, 2 + 2 = 5, that works for me. I think what he means... Oh, nice.
A little book plug for William James.
There you go. He tracked his book sales even before the days of Amazon. He was very adamant about that. He was a great man, but truth is what works. And that's sort of my approach, and is my approach throughout this book. Is
retaliation?
Yes. He's dead, okay? I'm not.
You're right. You're right.
So what I'm saying, okay, thank you. So what I'm saying is, I've tried to strip away the nonsense, of which there's plenty, and ask myself, is there a core of wisdom at the heart of this religion? And in almost every case, in the case of the Franciscans, Buddhists, etc., I found the answer was yes. And I think too many secularists and atheists tend to dismiss all of religion because there is hypocrisy and nonsense involved. There's hypocrisy and nonsense involved in science as well, but we don't throw out the scientific method because there's some corrupt scientists out there. Sorry, I get a bit worked up about that because I do find myself on the defensive with the sort of intellectual circles in which I travel when it comes to religion, because people just sort of assume that I didn't take it seriously, or my intention was to mock or just make fun of these religions, and that really was not the case.
No, I think you have a generous attitude toward them. I mean, it is a consistently entertaining book,
I mean, I ask you, I mean, you've written on the subject of God as well, and quite well. But do you sort of share my view there that there is almost a knee-jerk reaction against anything religious or spiritual? Spiritual maybe is another subject, but religion.
Yeah, religious. I think in the kinds of circles we would travel in, not everywhere in America, but yeah, I mean, it's ironic to me when the new atheists depict themselves as these courageous, I mean, it's like as if Dan Dennett at Tufts University encounters a lot of people who persecute him on grounds of his atheism, right? I mean, it's totally the opposite. It would take great courage to be at Tufts and stand up and declare yourself a born-again Christian at a faculty meeting.
Yes.
I think that's true. I find even when I look at, fairly abstract kind of manifestations of the religious question, such as is there any sense in which there might be a larger purpose unfolding? Leave aside a personal God, just talk about something pretty abstract. Even that question, which I've looked at a lot, and I think the answer is not necessarily no, it gets a fair amount of derision from intellectuals who I maintain have really not thought the project through.
Just the idea that there's more to the world than meets the eye.
Well, again, it gets back to how you mean that, But if you mean that there may be a purpose to life that's unfolding on this planet, which could mean a god, could mean, as the Raelian suggests, that extraterrestrials started the whole thing off. Although I would say if they started it off by planting the seeds of natural selection, which is not what the Raelians say. Could be even more, could not involve any intelligent being per se, but yeah, I think that's considered a silly and naive question in a lot of intellectual circles. Yeah.
I mean, I think that the problem that we run into is one of vocabulary. I think when we say the word God these days, we have this image of what Alan Watts called the cosmic male parent, the big man in the sky with the beard, the great producer or director, directing things. And, I prefer, Joseph Campbell's definition, I'm paraphrasing here, that God is all that, it's a metaphor for all that the intellect cannot grasp. And I kind of like that. It's a bit fuzzy, I realize, but I think that the problem is we don't have words to describe this. And also, religion is, for reasons I don't understand, trying to compete with science, which is a losing proposition. You can't out-science science. I think the Bible is stories, metaphors. And stories are important. We need them to get through life. We tell stories all the time in reality TV and Shakespeare and everything in between. But I think religion and religious leaders do a poor job of, in a way, selling their religion as the way I like to think of religion, which is applied philosophy. And another word for that, I suppose, is wisdom, which I don't believe science provides that much of. We've got all this technology and a lot of unhappy, unwise people out there.
Now, there are religious people who don't sell it that way because that's not what they mean by it. They mean there's a very personal God out there. There's heaven after you die. So, it's not always a question of semantics.
No, you're right. And I sort of come back to the proof in the pudding. The people I met in my journey in this book, every one of them described themselves as religious. Not, that kind of cop-out phrase, spiritual but not religious. You hear a lot of this in California. People describing themselves that way, and I don't know what they mean by that. I think maybe they mean they're deep people, but they're not like those Bible Belt people. I think it's kind of a cop out. But the people I met, and who I profile in this book in my journey, all described themselves as religious. And I don't think they were crazy or narrow-minded. I think they were people leading happy, meaningful lives, frankly, more happy and more meaningful than a lot of the atheists I know. So, I think we have to sort of start talking about, and I realize this may sound a bit crazy, good religion and bad religion. Not religions that are good or bad, but religion like good science and bad science. Good religion would produce followers who were happy, healthy, and giving. I mean, you look at the data on the surveys, people who are religious give more than people who are secular. People who are religious give more to secular causes than secular people give to secular causes. So there's something going on there.
And if these good people are motivated by beliefs that are factually false, in other words, say they believe that there's heaven after death and say there isn't heaven after death, is it still good religion?
Truth is what works. I mean, I would say yes, as long as they didn't, try to impose those beliefs or treated those beliefs as scientific fact. And I think that's where we run into trouble. They're different spheres. Terry Eagleton, the critic, said, to say that, well, now that we have science, we don't need religion, is like saying now that we have the toaster oven, we don't need Chekhov. Different spheres. They run into trouble when they start competing. And religious people are at least as much to blame as people in the scientific community. So, I went about the search open-minded, and that I just wanted to say that was my philosophy throughout this journey was, meet people, whether they're Franciscan, Buddhist, or Sufi or whatever. They may tell me they believe in this or that, but I didn't pay too much attention to that. I wanted to know, what did they do? And that's why our friend William James called his book The Varieties of Religious Experience, not the varieties of religious belief or the varieties of religious theology. It's the varieties of religious experience. James was interested in what people experience when they report having a religious experience. And if you read his book, which I think everyone should do, running throughout it is this current of appreciation, I think, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, there is a kind of admiration for these people who've had these experiences, even though James himself did not have them. He didn't treat these people as if they were nuts. And I think if the book's coming out today that sort of are Jamesian in that sense, you sort of almost have to treat anyone who reports having a religious experience as possibly schizophrenic. And I think that's a change we've seen in this country in the last 100 years.
So James also spent some time developing this philosophy of pragmatism, not that he invented it, but according to which the truth of a proposition has to do with whether when you act on the assumption of its truth, good things happen.
Truth is what works. That's pragmatism in a short sentence. And I like that. And I think, if you looked at people who go to church and believe in all these things that my secular friends don't believe in, heaven, hell, and all that, and you saw that they were happy and that they were giving and all these things, would you just say, well, that's not real happiness? I mean, statistically, Bob, people who are religious, as defined by people who attend religious services regularly, people who are religious are happier than people who aren't. And when I tell my friends this, secular friends, they say, well, they'll quip, ignorance is bliss. Or they won't think it's real happiness. So it can be a bit condescending, I think, frankly. If they say they're happy, they're happy. That's our definition of happiness in the 21st century, pretty much.
Okay, so we're getting a little low on time, but I want to at least allude to some other traditions you look at. Shamanism, paganism, I tend to think of as in the same broad category. The version of paganism was Wicca that you looked into mainly. Shamanism. I don't think you rated either of those at the top of the heap.
No. But let's talk about Wicca, for instance, which is hugely popular and growing in popularity. It's witchcraft, or at least that is a subset of Wicca. And that sounds weird I could probably not run for president now, Bob, well, because I've dabbled in witchcraft. So.
Probably not the only reason.
Well, there are many reasons, but that's the latest one. And I'll tell you what I liked about the Wiccans. Now, again, I'm not going to focus on beliefs that didn't appeal to me or ideas that didn't appeal to me. What I liked was the creative aspect of their ritual. I attended a coven of witches in the Pacific Northwest, sort of in this rural town in Washington State. And I'm watching this ritual, and it's very theatrical. It's almost Shakespearean, actors sort of are the gods, or they're animated like the gods. They are playing the role of Greek gods. And afterwards I asked my friend Jamie, who's a witch, a logical witch, she calls herself. I said, Jamie, how old is that ritual? She's still about 6 months old. We're still getting the kinks out of it. 6 months old. Because the Wiccans are essentially making it up as they go along. We don't know what these pre-Christian pagan religions really were like. So they'll take some, ancient Greek or Egyptian or whatever god or Norse god and come up with a script for the ritual. And so there's a freshness to it. Now, can you imagine going into a Catholic church or a synagogue and saying, excuse me, Father, that part in the Mass where you say that, you take your pen out and say, we could really jazz that up a little. I've got something I'm working on. Can I show it to you? That would be heresy, right? So, no ritual is born stale. It grows stale over time. And in Wicca, you have this freshness to the ritual. And you have this, they're polytheistic, of course, so you've got this pantheon to choose from. So, as Jamie, my friend, said, if she's not getting along with one of the gods, she can dump them and form a relationship with another god. And that seems fairly convenient. Yahweh is not dumpable. You don't dump Yahweh.
Speaking of Yahweh, you end your journey in Israel exploring Kabbalah, which I associate mainly, well, it's often depicted as a mystical variant of Judaism, but it also has this thing with the numbers where there's hidden meanings in the text.
Yeah, I didn't get into that too much. I'm more of a word person than a numbers person, but it is the mystical arm of Judaism essentially. And it appealed to me because it seemed to me to be the complete opposite of the Judaism that I grew up with, which was more arid and kind of severe. And here is basically a Judaism of the heart, or that's how it appeared to me. And, of course, it's been popularized by Madonna and somewhat, quite watered down in the sort of popular Kabbalah. But I went to this town in northern Israel called Tzfat, which has been the home of Kabbalistic teaching since the 16th century. And look, I really wasn't expecting too much. I wanted to sort of check off the Judaism box and get back to my Buddhism and more interesting, exotic Eastern faiths. But I was pleasantly surprised by what I found in Tzfat. Again, the people, they seem to be these sort of spiritual refugees from the world of Orthodox Judaism and also refugees from the secular world looking for this Judaism of the heart, which Kabbalah, I think, is.
So what's something you would do as part of that practice that you wouldn't do as part of mainstream Judaism, and something that you liked and found valid?
The way they welcome the Sabbath. Now, many Kabbalists do go to synagogue, but I met this man, David, originally from America, been living in Tzfat for 30, 40 years, calls himself an ultra-Paradox Jew. And he welcomes the Sabbath by doing a walking meditation in the woods outside of Tzfat. And he asked me to join him one Sabbath evening. And at first I thought, well, this is a Buddhist thing, walking meditation. And he says it is, but it's also Kabbalistic. The Kabbalists were very much into nature, and they would go out into the woods and welcome the Sabbath on Friday evening. And so we were walking, slowly in this meditative way, which is very hard to do, but also you become very aware of the sounds around you, of the feel of the ground underneath your feet. And it seems to me that if the Jewish Sabbath is about slowing down, about getting back in touch with nature, about tuning out sort of the workaday world, in getting in touch with God, however you define him or her, this seemed like a good way, a good thing to do, to welcome the Sabbath, as opposed to being in a crowded synagogue reading from a text that you don't understand, which I'm not saying that's the only way to experience the Sabbath in a synagogue, but for me, this seemed accessible. This seemed like a good thing. And
maybe partly as a result of that, at the end of the book, you seemed a little more in touch with your Jewish roots than...
Yeah, I am. I mean, I met a friend of mine named Yossi Klein Halevi, also an author, in Jerusalem. And I told him about all these things I did. I think maybe I left out the Raelians. I didn't want to shock him. But I told him about the Buddhism and the Sufism. And he listened. He said, this is great. He said, this is great. But, we need you. The Jews need you, need people like you, sort of free-thinking people. And he also said something to me I won't forget. He said, religion is a language of intimacy with God. Religion is a language of intimacy with God, and you need to speak one fluently before you can learn others. And that kind of floored me, I think, because until then I was thinking I didn't really have to choose. I could sort of cobble together what I call an IKEA God, some assembly required. A little bit here, a little bit there. Why settle for one? Just borrow from all these wisdom traditions, which I do think we can do, with the cautionary note that you need to be grounded in something. And what Yossi was saying to me is you should be grounded in Judaism. Not you should, but consider that possibility. And all I can say is now I'm deeply considering it, and I am more Jewish than I was before I began the book, but I'm also more Buddhist, for instance. I begin the day with the Buddhist meditation, and about once every month or so I join Sufi friends at a zikr, where I do say aloud, La ilaha illa Allah, there is no God but God. And I think that's okay. I think God can handle that. He doesn't get confused that easily.
Right. I mean, it seems to me a Jewish background is more amenable to that kind of synthesis, though, than say a Christian background, in the sense that, it's an identity. You can give up all religious belief and still be part of the tribe if you're Jewish, right? And a Christian doesn't have that option.
Have you read much Thomas Merton? A bit of him? Yeah, very ecumenical, definitely grounded in Catholicism, Trappist monk that he was, very contemplative, but really reached out to other religions, had dialogues with Buddhist teachers. In fact, when he died, he was in Bangkok attending a Buddhist conference, I believe, when he died of an accident in his hotel room. So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I do hear you that Christianity says you must believe in this. But it is unusual in that sense. And this is one point I want to make is, I think in this country we get too hung up on the question of religious belief. And that's always the reflexive question we ask one another. What do you believe? What are your religious beliefs? Is what we ask our politicians, as if that were the gauges for your religiosity. Well, I don't really care what you believe. I don't think William James would care what you believe. He would care about what you do and what you experience. So I think you're a little bit right that Christianity places a greater emphasis on belief and therefore makes it more difficult to have this sort of assembled God. But there are plenty of examples of Christian leaders, Christian lay people too, who are more ecumenical. I think, yeah.
I mean, if I was brought up Christian, if I go back to the people who were in congregations that I went to as a child or something and say, hey, I'm here, I'm still part of the tribe, they're like, no, you're just not. This tribe is defined by belief. And that's just mainstream Christianity. That's the idea. It's a belief-defined congregation. They'd say you're still an American. We're both Americans, but you're not.
I mean, that is true. That is true. And that probably explains why we talk about religion in so much in terms of belief in this country, because we're a Christian nation demographically, at least. But if you look at the traditions within Christianity, you have a lot of practices that are somewhat similar to others. You have meditation within Christianity. You have service, of course. You have music. You have techniques, spiritual techniques that overlap with other traditions. I don't think there's any such thing as a pure religion out there. Maybe the Zoroastrians, but they're dying out because they don't allow for conversion. But I think every religion is a hybrid, and I think that's good. We like hybrids, right? So, yeah, but I mean, your point is you're saying you can't go back and be like you're either Christian or you're not. You can't be, we have the term Jubu for a Jewish Buddhist or Jufi for a Jewish Sufi, but you can't be a Christian. It doesn't even sound right, does it? So, I mean, is that a bad thing for you? I mean, you find that a limitation of Christianity that you can't be a hyphenated Christian?
I think it complicates things for a kind of modern day seeker with a Christian background. Yeah. In other words, I think part of the resonance of the ending of your book is that you have returned to your roots, and you can kind of hang on to as much of those roots as you want while adopting.
Well, that's only true in certain Jewish circles. And in ultra-Orthodox circles, I probably could not. But Judaism, as is practiced in America today, is loose enough that there are synagogues and places you can go to. The synagogue I belong to even has meditation classes and yoga classes, and this is fairly common. And that's the other point I want to make is there's this porousness to our religious practices. We're not always aware of them. You take yoga, for instance. Churches do offer yoga. Now, yoga is a Hindu-based tradition. I mean, it's become more calisthenics in this country, but that's where it comes from. That's where it's rooted. So, Christianity might borrow from Buddhism without being fully aware of it. So that even though you, Bob, go back and rejoin a church and you say, now I'm a member of the tribe, I'm Christian. Well, what does that mean? Yes, you believe in this or that, but you might be doing things that have borrowed from other religions. I mean, in Jesus' time, Buddhism had been around for 500 or 600 years, and there were Buddhist monasteries as far afield as Alexandria in Egypt, not that far from where Jesus lived. So religions are always borrowing from one another.
Okay, so at the end, it sounds like this all did make a difference. And, you describe yourself in parts of the book. You use the word depressed repeatedly. And you describe yourself as not just a melancholy person, but an intermittently actually depressed person.
I think that's accurate. Yeah, I mean, I would say I do suffer from occasional clinical depression. There's certainly people who suffer a lot worse than me, but that's part of my makeup, whether that's genetics or what, I don't know. But and I felt if I was going to write this book and write it honestly, I couldn't just leave that part out. So I wrote about it.
And has that changed as a result of what you found?
It's changed a bit. I find some of the spiritual techniques, practices, such as meditation, such as something called the Sudarshan Kriya, which is actually a Hindu breathing technique I picked up along the way, to be helpful. To be helpful in the way that exercise, I also find helps alleviate my depression. And so do these other spiritual practices. So yeah, I have find it helpful. But anyone who suffers from depression knows it's sort of like being an alcoholic, which I'm not. But as I understand it, you're never, you can be in remission, but you're always an alcoholic. And I think if you suffer from depression, you always have that tendency to lapse back into depression. So these spiritual practices are another tool you can use along with diet and exercise and things like that.
And you must have done the actual writing of the book while in remission, because, the book has a consistently kind of lighthearted, entertaining, comic tone that I would think would be hard to pull off if you were...
Well, some of the greatest comedians in the world suffer from depression. Jim Carrey's talked about it and others. So those two are not mutually exclusive. And as far as my approach... I was walking a fine line, Bob, because I like to write funny. I find humor can be useful. It can be used to illuminate a truth. It can also be used to conceal a truth, but at its best can be used to illuminate truth. And I wanted to have fun with it. And just because it's got the word God in the title, why can't it be fun? but it's tricky. People don't like to have their religions made fun of, even though G.K. Chesterton once said the test of a good religion is whether one can laugh at it or not. And I think that it's true. That the people I met who I was most impressed with, they could laugh at. They were telling, the Buddhists I met were telling Buddhist jokes. The Jews were telling Jewish jokes. But it is a fine line, because you do have books about religion that are funny, but they tend to be mocking. And I was not trying to mock anyone in this book except for one person, and that was me on occasion.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess I was. What I was thinking was, when you're actually, if you're feeling depressed, or even just kind of severe melancholy, and sit down to write, I would think that you would not write in the tone that this book is written in. So I'm thinking one of two things: either when you're really depressed, you don't write, or when you're really depressed and you sit down to write, you cheer up a little.
Yeah, I think those are true. I mean, look at David Foster Wallace and other writers who have suffered from depression. If you're too depressed, you don't write, you don't do anything. If you're too happy, I think you don't write either. I think that there needs to be, I once met this, he was actually a composer in Iceland, and he described it to me this way. He said, he's a happy person, but he said, but he cherishes his melancholia. And I think I like that expression. I think as a writer, you have to some extent, cherish your melancholia. Otherwise, you're too busy out there being happy. You might be the exception to that rule. You might be the perfectly happy person who also writes very prodigiously. So,
you're 0 for 2 on that conjecture.
All right.
But anyway, great book, and entertaining, but not only entertaining. So, thanks so much for taking the time, Eric.
Thank you, Bob. This was a lot of fun. We could have talked for hours.
We almost did, I think.
Okay. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.